In the lesson for September the 20th, we look at Genesis chapter 3. If you'll open your Bible to that passage, we'll walk through the passage together. Let me begin with a question. Have you ever been in a situation that suddenly shifts from advantageous to disastrous? You know, at one moment you're on top of the world, and then the next moment it seems like the bottom falls out. It happens all the time. A well-known Olympic athlete whose lucrative contract with commercials is voided when he's accused of killing his girlfriend. A politician who's elected to represent a state in Washington, and all of a sudden he is disgraced because they discover that he's texting pictures of himself to people. I mean, it happens all the time. You're on top of the world, and all of a sudden the bottom drops out. But nobody fell so far, so fast as the human beings called Adam and Eve that we described in last week's lesson, their creation, and in this week's lesson, chapter 3, we describe their fall. Now, it all happens in the biblical story with this confrontation with Satan in chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Now, we need to remember that Adam and Eve have it made. You know, they are in an ideal situation. Created in God's image for fellowship with Him, they bask in the glow of God's presence. Created with a relationship hunger for another human being, they have each other. This leaving and cleaving process we described last week's lesson. Created with needs for physical nourishment, they are surrounded by fruit and vegetables and things that they can eat. At the end of Genesis 2, at the end of last week's lesson, human beings are in an ideal situation. But before chapter 3 is done, they have lost it all and they are kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So what in the world happened? How did it happen? How can we understand this reverse in fortune? Well, the biblical writer ties it all to Adam and Eve's disobedience of God. And we describe the result of this as the fall of humanity. And by their fall, Adam and Eve introduced sin into the human community. Now notice the steps that they go through. I have these outlined on your outline. The first step was curiosity. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord has made, and he said to the woman. Now do you get the picture there? A serpent, a snake, saying something, talking. So we have an animal doing something that an animal does not ordinarily do, and all of a sudden he has Eve's curiosity. The next step is doubt. The question in verse 1 seems innocent enough. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? In other words, if God really loves you, would He say this? That's the first point of the doubt. And then in verse 4, He leads her to doubt God's honesty. He says in verse 4, "You will not surely die."